After days of combat, you expect silence. You expect to see the enemy stop. You expect to see signs of attrition. But the opposite appeared in the German reports. A short, direct sentence, written without drama. Precisely for that reason, so unsettling. They keep coming. It wasn't British propaganda. It wasn't a political speech. It was an internal German document, written after weeks of fighting troops that they didn't break. They didn't disappear. They didn't lose their rhythm. Every advance was costly, every night was heavy, but the next day they were there again, the same positions pressed, the same lines tested, the same feeling that containing didn't mean winning. This video isn't about exaggerated bravery or war myths. It's about how the British Army became a real problem, constant and psychological, for those trying to stop him. Let's delve into the context of this report to understand why was it written, what was happening on the battlefield at that moment, and why, when this document came to light after the war, it caused discomfort even among German veterans. Stay until the end, because the phrase "they keep coming" wasn't a compliment. It was a notice. Understanding this warning completely changes how you view those weeks of war. Have you ever stopped to think what leads an entire army to admit in an internal report that it cannot stop the enemy? Not in public speeches, not in propaganda, but on paper, away from the cameras. That's what we're going to reveal here. If this kind of real, raw, and well-told story makes sense to you, leave a like now, because that helps the video reach those who also like to understand war unfiltered. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters, because what comes after this report completely changes the interpretation of these battles. And write in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to know where you're following this story from. When the first reports began to circulate, no one in the German command thought there was anything extraordinary about them. It was just another routine update, the kind that accumulates on desks overflowing with maps, numbers, and urgent requests. The problem is that as the days passed, the tone changed. Not dramatically, not with grandiose words, but quite the opposite. It became drier, more direct, more worried. And that's where the shock begins. Because what was being described wasn't a great British maneuver or a spectacular victory. It was something more unsettling, the feeling that, despite everything that was being done to contain them, the soldiers of British Army, they simply wouldn't stop. On paper, the German strategy seemed sound. Airstrikes, constant pressure, physical and psychological attrition, disruption of supply lines. Everything that, in theory, should reduce the combat capability of any army. But on the ground, the effect was not as expected. British troops retreated when needed, quickly reorganized, and returned to occupy positions or pressure-critical sectors. There was no visible collapse, no classic moment when the enemy disappears from the map for a few days. They were always there, sometimes less visible, sometimes more cautious, but never absent. What truly began to bother them wasn't a specific defeat, but the repetition. Day after day, night after night, the reports described the same pattern. Worn-out British units were replaced by others. Pressed sectors didn't remain empty for long, even after heavy bombardments. When confusion and disorganization were expected, organized resistance emerged. For those accustomed to seeing enemies break after a certain level of pressure, this was disconcerting. And within the Wehrmacht, a silent question began to form, one that no one wanted to ask aloud. Why isn't this working? It's important to understand that this shock didn't stem from admiration for the enemy, but from frustration. For German commanders, war was always conceived in terms of rhythm and initiative. To advance, to press, to force errors, but there, facing the British, the rhythm didn't break. The initiative wasn't completely lost. Even when positions changed, The feeling was the same. The problem wasn't solved. There were always more men, more units, more capacity to continue, and this begins to weigh not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of those planning the war. As the weeks went by, the reports made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. The pattern repeated itself in different sectors at different times. Always the same difficulty in transforming military pressure into real paralysis of the adversary. For those who read these documents later, in the post-war period, the phrase that became famous seems simple, but at that moment it was a summary of something much larger, an uncomfortable realization that the enemy was not reacting as expected. It didn't panic, it didn't collapse, it just kept going. And perhaps the most disturbing thing was this. There was no single event that explained everything, no single battle that resolved the issue. It was the accumulation, the constant repetition of encounters, restrained advances, calculated retreats, and swift returns. Each report added a small piece to this picture until the realization became impossible to ignore. Something was different. Something in that prolonged confrontation was deviating from the traditional script of war, and it is precisely at this point that the phrase begins to gain weight, because it doesn't stem from a moment of anger or immediate despair, but from a cold analysis made after weeks of looking at the same problem without finding a clear solution. From here, what seemed like just an observation begins to transform into a more serious warning. And understanding how this perception evolved is what completely changes the interpretation of what came after. Before prolonged contact, the German expectation was clear and, to a certain extent, logical. Within the way they viewed the war up to that point, for the German command, the British Army, it wasn't seen as weak but as predictable. The interpretation was simple: professional, disciplined, well-trained soldiers, but limited by distance, dependence on maritime supplies, and the natural wear and tear of a long war. In the minds of many officers, it would be enough to apply continuous pressure, slow the pace, and force errors for the system to begin to fail. That's how other campaigns had worked. There was no reason at that moment to believe it would be different. This expectation stemmed from a dangerous combination of overconfidence and past experiences. Wehrmacht, she was accustomed to rapid campaigns, decisive advances, and enemies who, under constant pressure, ended up giving up ground in a disorganized manner. The mental model was this: you hit hard, you hit fast, you keep the enemy under stress, and at some point they break. On paper, the British fit this scenario: an army far from home, dependent on long supply lines, facing bombardment and continuous psychological attrition. The equation seemed balanced. However, there was a detail that went almost unnoticed at the beginning. The Germans expected clear signs of weakening within relatively short periods. They expected positions to be abandoned for longer, visible delays in response, coordination failures. They expected to see fatigue turn into error, and in the first few days, some of these signs even seemed to emerge: small retreats, rapid reorganizations, temporary silence in certain sectors. To those observing from afar, this confirmed the initial thesis: the pressure was working. The problem is that these signs never evolved into anything bigger. As time went on, this expectation began to generate a frustration that was difficult to explain. Each British retreat was interpreted as the beginning of a collapse that never came. Each reorganization seemed temporary, but ended with the same positions being contested again. There was no comfortable interval in which the enemy disappears from the radar, allowing you to breathe and consolidate control. On the contrary, the feeling was of always dealing with something unfinished, as if no action was enough to end the problem. This began to particularly bother the officers responsible for planning, because for them, war wasn't just about direct combat, but about calculation. It was about predicting reactions, anticipating movements, understanding the enemy's behavior. And British behavior wasn't fitting the expected model. They weren't reacting impulsively. They weren't responding with desperate attacks or chaotic retreats. They acted methodically, almost irritatingly, always maintaining some level of pressure, even when they seemed to be at a disadvantage. Gradually, it became clear that the initial expectation had been too simplistic. Not because the British were invincible, but because the system behind them was more resilient than imagined. Attrition existed, losses existed, fatigue was real, but all of this was absorbed in a way that prevented the domino effect the Germans expected to see. And when you base your entire strategy on the idea that the enemy will break at a certain point, realizing that this point may not exist is deeply unsettling. It is at this moment that the interpretation changes. What was previously seen as a temporary phase begins to be viewed as a pattern. And when a pattern doesn't fit your predictions, it ceases to be just a detail and becomes a strategic problem. The German expectation, built before the prolonged contact, begins to crumble silently. And what is most unsettling is that this change is not accompanied by a major event or a clear defeat. It comes from repetition, from the British insistence on remaining present, even when everything indicated that they should have already ceded ground. And it is precisely from this break in expectations that the reports begin to take on a different tone. Because when the war doesn't behave as you planned, every little detail starts to be observed more closely. And what they begin to notice next will further deepen this feeling that they were dealing with something that wouldn't be resolved in the traditional way. The third point arises when the surprise ceases to be merely a vague impression and begins to be recorded almost automatically in the reports. It was no longer an isolated feeling of a tired officer, but something that was repeated in different sectors on different days with very similar words. The realization was simple and at the same time disconcerting. The applied pressure was not producing the expected effect. The troops of British Army, they didn't disappear from the battlefield. They slowed down for a moment, adjusted positions, changed their approach, and continued. For those on the other side, this was beginning to generate a specific kind of wear and tear, not just physical, but mental, as, well, war often teaches that after a certain level of effort, the enemy begins to make more serious mistakes. Communication fails, orders become confused, units become disorganized. But this wasn't happening as expected. Even under constant pressure, the British maintained a minimum standard of operation. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but it was enough to prevent any feeling of definitive victory. What was most striking was the absence of real pauses. Normally, after a heavy bombardment or a successful offensive, a period of silence is expected, an interval in which the enemy needs to regroup. Here, that interval hardly existed. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes less. When it was believed that a position had been neutralized, signs of activity would appear. Small movements, patrols, sporadic fire. Not enough for an immediate counterattack, but enough to make it clear that the area was not yet dead. Inside the Wehrmacht, this began to generate increasing discomfort. There was no way to point to a single mistake, a clear planning failure. Orders were being executed, resources were being applied, operations continued. Yet the final result always seemed incomplete. It was like pushing something heavy uphill and realizing that even after advancing a few meters, it never stopped resisting. This pattern began to appear almost mechanically in the reports. Resistance resumed, persistent enemy activity, continuous pressure, simple words repeated, without drama, and, perhaps for that very reason so revealing, they indicated that the problem was not in a specific battle, but in the general behavior of the enemy. The British ability to remain present even when not advancing undermined any sense of absolute control of the terrain. As the days passed, this continuity came to be seen as something strategic, not accidental. It wasn't just individual courage or stubbornness. There was a method behind it. The British units seemed to know when to retreat a little, when to hold, when to reappear. It wasn't a desperate move, but a calculated one, and that made everything harder to predict. You didn't know exactly when the next contact would come, you just knew it would come. The impact of this on planning was enormous. Each operation needed to consider that the enemy wouldn't simply disappear after being subjected to pressure. It was necessary to maintain resources, personnel, and constant attention because any relaxation could be exploited. This need for permanent vigilance increased general fatigue and created the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. You advance, you press, you wear yourself down, and nothing truly ends. It is at this moment that the idea of continuity begins to weigh more than any number of losses, because losses can be calculated, compensated for, explained. Constant persistence cannot. It erodes trust, little by little, day after day. And when this starts to become clear to those who write the reports, the language changes again, almost imperceptibly. The focus shifts from just what has been done to what has not yet been resolved. And this change of perspective prepares the ground for something even more unsettling, which begins to appear soon after. The fourth point begins to emerge when the reports stop focusing solely on direct contact with the enemy and start to touch, even if indirectly, on something deeper. The structure behind that continuous resistance. Gradually it becomes clear that the problem wasn't simply the British soldier in the field, but everything that sustained that soldier, day after day. The ability to continue fighting didn't come from improvisation, but from a system that functioned even under pressure. And that was starting to truly bother them, because systems are much harder to break than isolated men. For those observing from the German side, the logic was simple. The longer an enemy unit remains in combat, the more it becomes exhausted. Food, ammunition, and rest are lacking. At some point, this accumulation should lead to serious failures. However, in the case of the German troops, British Army, that moment always seemed to be postponed. When one unit was clearly exhausted, another would spring up in its place. When a position seemed at its limit, there was a replacement. None of this was spectacular, but everything was efficient enough to keep the pressure on. This perception changes the tone of the writer. It's no longer just about reporting what happened that day, but about trying to understand how it continues to be possible. British logistics, even under constant attacks, continued to supply the front. Supply lines suffered interruptions, of course, but they didn't collapse. There was always a minimum amount of resources arriving. There was always some level of organization preserved. And, in war, that minimum is often all you need to keep fighting. Another point that begins to emerge is discipline, not that rigid, theatrical discipline, but the practical discipline of daily life. The British didn't seem to react chaotically to the blows they suffered. There were no great impulsive advances followed by collapses. There was routine, and routine in war is a powerful thing. It means that even under fire, orders continue to be understood, schedules continue to exist, and duties continue to be performed. This gives the soldier a sense of normalcy that protects the mind from total collapse. Inside the Wehrmacht, this began to be perceived almost as an invisible obstacle. You can bombard a position, you can force a retreat, you can inflict casualties. But when the enemy returns, organized, supplied, and with functional command, the psychological effect of the attack is diluted. And what should have been a decisive blow becomes just another episode within a larger sequence. This British ability to rotate units also began to attract attention. It wasn't done hastily or haphazardly. The exchanges happened without major, visible disruptions, For those trying to break the enemy line, this created the feeling that they were never facing an opponent truly at their limit. There was always someone relatively more rested taking on critical positions. This didn't eliminate attrition, but it prevented it from turning into total collapse. The effect of all this goes beyond the immediate battlefield. It begins to affect command decisions. Operations need to be maintained for longer than anticipated. Resources are continuously consumed without a sense of definitive progress, and little by little the impression arises of fighting against something that recovers faster than expected. Not because it is invulnerable, but because it was prepared to absorb losses without losing its basic function. What's most unsettling is that none of this appears as a single, isolated revelation. They are small observations, scattered across different reports, written by different people at different times. But when you put it all together, the picture becomes clear. It's not just about facing determined soldiers, but about facing a machine that even under pressure continues to operate. And that completely changes the nature of the problem. It is from this understanding that war begins to weigh on you in a different way, because destroying an attack is one thing. Dismantling an entire system is another, much more complex one, and when this difference becomes evident, the feeling of control diminishes even further. What seemed like mere resistance begins to transform into something more difficult to handle. And this perception will have a direct impact not only on the battlefield, but also on the minds of those who need to plan the next move. At the fifth point, something changes level. Up until then, the problem seemed technical, almost mechanical. Pressure that doesn't cause collapse, a system that continues to function, logistics that insist on surviving. But now, the effect begins to appear where it is least possible to measure, in the mind of the person trying to contain all of this. The psychological impact begins to emerge silently, almost discreetly, but constantly. It's not immediate fear, it's not panic, it's accumulated mental exhaustion, that kind of tension that grows when you realize that nothing you do seems to solve the problem for good. For many German officers and soldiers, war had always been conceived as a logical sequence of actions and reactions. You attack, the enemy yields. You press harder, they break. But faced with the troops of British Army, this logic was starting to fail. There wasn't that moment of psychological relief where you feel the situation is resolved. Even after successful operations, the feeling wasn't one of victory, but of a temporary pause. And living in a constant state of pause is more tiring than direct combat. The accounts begin to reveal this unease between the lines, not in explicit words, but in the way events are described. Expressions like resumed activity, persistent presence, or continuous pressure appear repeatedly. This is no coincidence. They reveal a mind that no longer expects complete silence from the other side. They reveal the perception that the enemy doesn't disappear, it only adapts. And this creates a permanent tension because you never know when you can lower your guard. This type of attrition affects decisions. When you believe the enemy could reappear at any moment, every choice carries more weight. Advancing too far seems risky. Retreating too far seems dangerous. Consolidating positions requires constant attention. And this continuous vigilance consumes mental energy. Soldiers and officers begin to operate in a near-permanent state of alert, without the psychological compensation of clear progress. Inside the Wehrmacht, this begins to generate a curious effect. The frustration doesn't come from clear defeats, but from the absence of conclusions. The war becomes a sequence of unfinished tasks. Each sector always seems almost resolved, but never completely. And this erodes confidence little by little. Not dramatically, but persistently. It's the kind of pressure that doesn't explode, but seeps in. There is also the direct impact on those on the front lines. Knowing that, even after a tough night, the next day will likely bring renewed contact with the same enemy weighs more heavily than facing something unknown. The predictable, in this case, becomes exhausting. There is no surprise, no pause, no sense of closure, only the certainty that the confrontation will continue, somehow, at some point in the sector. This scenario begins to create a gap between what the plans promise and what the battlefield delivers. On the maps, everything seems under control. On paper, the objectives are clear. But in practice, the constant British presence transforms each advance into something provisional. This generates a kind of strategic anxiety because the war ceases to be a sequence of accumulated victories and becomes a struggle to keep the situation manageable. The most interesting thing is that this psychological impact doesn't stem from major losses, but from persistence. Losses can be explained, justified, rationalized. The enemy's continued persistence cannot. It challenges the internal logic of those who plan and execute the war. And when that logic begins to fail, trust also begins to crack, even if no one openly admits it. This is where the phrase that would later become famous begins to make even more sense, because it doesn't just summarize a tactical observation, but a state of mind, a silent recognition that the problem was no longer just physical or operational, but psychological. And understanding how this feeling spread helps explain why subsequent reports become increasingly attentive to something that goes beyond maps and numbers. In the sixth point, attention begins to shift definitively from the immediate battlefield to something that had previously been underestimated: British training and how it shaped the behavior of the average soldier under continuous pressure. We are not talking about exaggerated bravery or individual heroic gestures, but something much colder and more effective. What the Germans gradually began to realize was that they were facing troops prepared to withstand exactly the type of war that was taking place. Not a quick and decisive war, but a long, repetitive, exhausting, and mentally draining one. The soldier of British Army, he didn't seem to react like someone expecting a quick victory. On the contrary, he acted like someone trained to endure, to remain in position even when progress didn't come, to accept setbacks without interpreting them as defeat, to accomplish simple tasks day after day under fire without the need for grand speeches or emotional outbursts. This, for those observing from the other side, began to become clear not in grand episodes, but in the small details of constant contact. The reports begin to reflect this indirectly. There are no phrases praising the enemy, but there are descriptions that reveal surprise at the consistency of British behavior. The units did not panic collectively after heavy attacks. They did not abandon positions in a disorderly manner. When they retreated, they did so in a controlled way. When they returned, they did not appear disorganized. This type of response does not arise from improvisation. It is the result of repeated training, focused on endurance, functional obedience, and adaptation to stress. Another point that begins to weigh heavily is how the British soldier seemed to deal with the routine of combat. War was not treated as an extraordinary event that needed to be won quickly, but as hard work that needed to be done every day. This completely changes the psychological dynamic. Those who expect a quick outcome tend to get frustrated when it doesn't come. Those trained for continuity do not. And this difference begins to appear clearly as the weeks go by. Inside the Wehrmacht, this begins to create an uncomfortable narrative. The German mental model, based on intense pace and rapid collapse of the adversary, struggled against troops that did not react emotionally as expected. There were no major signs of visible despair. There was fatigue, yes, there were losses, yes, but there was also a cold acceptance of the situation, and this made the task of breaking the enemy much more difficult. British training was also reflected in the ability to operate even in imperfect conditions. Lack of comfort, sleepless nights, constant pressure. All of this was part of the package. The soldier was not expected to be in ideal fighting condition. He was expected to fight despite it. This seemingly simple detail has a huge impact on prolonged wars, because it eliminates the expectation that the enemy will stop just because conditions have become bad. Over time, this perception begins to solidify. It wasn't just about well-equipped or well-supplied units, but about men trained not to depend on momentary motivation. They didn't need to feel they were winning to continue. They only needed to carry out the next order. And this, repeated thousands of times, creates a type of resilience that doesn't appear on maps or in numbers, but that imposes itself in practice. This understanding begins to weigh on subsequent planning. If the enemy is trained to withstand continuous pressure, then pressure alone ceases to be sufficient. Each new operation needs to consider that the desired psychological effect may not occur. And when this conclusion begins to form, war ceases to be merely a matter of applied force and becomes a matter of time, attrition, and patience. It is at this point that the confrontation takes on an even more complex layer, because now it is not just about confronting positions or systems, but about confronting a mentality molded to resist. And this realization, although not explicitly written, begins to seep into subsequent reports, preparing the ground for an even more unsettling reading of what was to come. In the seventh point, perception gains even greater weight, because it ceases to seem localized or circumstantial. It is no longer possible to say that it was happening because of a specific commander, a poorly assessed sector, or an unfortunate sequence of decisions. What begins to become clear is that the same pattern repeats itself on different fronts at different times, whenever contact with British troops is prolonged. And when a behavior repeats itself like this, it ceases to be the exception and becomes the rule. Reports from different areas begin to echo the same frustration, even without knowing each other. The language changes little, but the meaning is the same. Temporary containment, applied attrition, renewed British response. For those who read this in sequence, it becomes impossible to ignore. No matter the terrain, no matter the initial intensity of the attack, no matter the time, the British presence returns, sometimes more discreet, sometimes more cautious, but always present. And this begins to undermine any attempt to explain the problem as something isolated. The most troubling aspect is that this pattern doesn't depend on major British offensives. Often it manifests itself precisely when there isn't a clear attack. The simple fact that the British maintain activity, patrols, localized fire, and constant pressure is enough to prevent the feeling of total control. This forces the other side to keep men, weapons, and attention tied to a sector that theoretically should already be resolved. And the more sectors that fall into this logic, the greater the accumulated burden becomes. Inside the Wehrmacht, this begins to generate a silent strategic problem, because war is not just about victories and defeats, but about priorities. When everything demands constant attention, nothing can be considered truly secure. And this inability to close fronts creates a wear and tear that doesn't appear in casualty numbers, but it does appear in the continuous use of resources and mainly in the exhaustion of the men. From the British side, there is no rush to decide everything at once. Troops of British Army, they don't seem to operate with the expectation of an immediate final blow. They act as if they understand that the war will continue tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the following week. This completely changes the dynamics of the confrontation. Instead of seeking a spectacular breakthrough, the focus shifts to maintaining pressure, maintaining presence, keeping the adversary trapped in a cycle of constant reaction. This type of approach is particularly exhausting for those on the receiving end, because it doesn't offer a clear target to be destroyed in order to end the problem. There's no obvious moment when you can say, "It's over." Everything remains open. And This feeling of something unfinished begins to repeat itself in different reports, coming from different officers, until it forms a picture that's difficult to ignore. What was once described as resistance is now understood as a method. It's not improvisation, it's not isolated stubbornness. It's a way of waging war. And when this understanding begins to emerge, it brings with it an uncomfortable question. If this is happening in several places at the same time, how long will it be possible to sustain this level of effort without obtaining decisive results? The repetition of this pattern on different fronts begins to weigh on major decisions. Each new operation needs to consider that even initial success may not translate into lasting control. This forces a second thought process before deploying troops, before reducing presence, before assuming a sector is secure. And this forced caution slows everything down. The war ceases to advance at the planned pace and becomes managed, almost contained day after day. It is at this point that the impact ceases to be merely local and begins to spread throughout the overall planning. Because when the same problem appears in multiple places, it stops being a tactical detail and becomes a strategic factor. And understanding this is essential to understanding why, from this point on, the reports begin to sound less like simple records and more like warnings. Warnings that what seemed like mere British insistence was, in fact, creating a much greater effect than initially imagined. In the 8th point, everything that had been observed in a scattered way finally begins to be condensed. It's no longer just loose notes, field impressions, or curious repetitions in different reports. The need arises to put the problem into clear words because it has ceased to be merely operational and now demands the attention of high command. It is in this context that the report that would later attract so much attention appears, not as a dramatic document, but precisely as the opposite, cold, direct, almost bureaucratic, and that is exactly what makes it so powerful. The text does not attempt to justify failures or find culprits. It describes a situation that had been felt for weeks, the difficulty in breaking the British rhythm and the inability to transform constant pressure into a real standstill. The report does not speak of a major German defeat, because it did not exist at that moment. It speaks of something more uncomfortable, the realization that despite repeated efforts, the final result remained incomplete. Each action solved an immediate problem but created another one further down the line. This is where the famous phrase gains context. It doesn't emerge as an emotional outburst, but as a synthesis. After pages and pages describing attacks, responses, retreats, and resumptions, someone reduces it all to a simple observation. They keep coming, not as praise, not as admiration, but as an uncomfortable recognition that the pattern persists, regardless of what is done to interrupt it. This phrase functions almost as a period at the end of a line of reasoning that had been gradually building up. What's most revealing is the tone. There's no exaggerated surprise nor indignation. There's a restrained weariness. The language suggests that the writer no longer expects a quick solution. It's as if the report is saying, between the lines, that this traditional method of attrition wasn't delivering on its promises. And when a military command reaches this point, it means something fundamental needs to be rethought. It's no longer about executing the same strategy better, but about admitting that it might not work as planned. This report also serves another important function. It connects isolated experiences. What previously seemed like a local problem now appears as part of a larger picture. The same difficulties described on different fronts are brought together in a single reading, and this changes the perception of the problem. It is no longer possible to attribute everything to specific circumstances or isolated errors. Repetition becomes evidence, and evidence in war weighs much more than opinion. For those who read this document later, in the post-war period, its strength lies precisely in this sobriety. There is no attempt to construct a heroic narrative, nor to soften the situation. There is only a record of something that contradicted deep-seated expectations, the idea that constant pressure by itself would solve the problem. The report shows that this idea was failing, not spectacularly, but persistently, and that is much more difficult to deal with. From that moment on, the phrase ceases to be merely an observation and takes on strategic weight. It begins to circulate, albeit in a limited way, as a warning, not about a specific battle, but about a type of confrontation that was draining time, resources, and mental energy. A confrontation that offered no clear point of closure. And that's precisely where the importance of this report widens, because it doesn't just describe what happened, but signals a limit to the German expectation of controlling the pace of the war in the way it had done before. From this point on, decisions are made with this realization in mind, and understanding what this report represented helps explain why, soon after, the strategic interpretation of the situation begins to change decisively. At the 9th point, the phrase ceases to be merely an internal record and begins to influence how the war is conceived within that sector. When a report of this type reaches the high command, it is not read as a curiosity, but as a sign of a structural problem. The realization that they keep coming forces a silent revision of expectations. It is no longer a question of how to apply more pressure, but of recognizing that pressure alone is not producing the expected decisive effect. Against the troops of British Army, this has a direct impact on strategy. Plans that previously relied on rapid attrition now require longer timeframes. Resources that should be released to other sectors need to remain where they are. Because there is no guarantee of real stability, every position taken needs to be defended for longer. Every advance needs to be consolidated cautiously. The war is beginning to lose momentum. Not because of a lack of strength, but because of a lack of closure. Nothing seems definitively resolved. This change is especially burdensome because it doesn't come with a clear alternative. Recognizing that something isn't working is one thing. Knowing what to do instead is another. The German leadership faces an uncomfortable dilemma. Insist on a strategy that clearly doesn't deliver the promised results, or redistribute efforts, risking creating loopholes in sectors that are never truly quiet. And while this decision matures, the cost accumulates. The effect of this is evident in how operations are described. The tone becomes more cautious, more defensive. There's no longer just talk of advancing, but of holding back, avoiding unnecessary losses. These are signs that the initiative is beginning to be shared, not imposed. The constant British presence forces the other side to react, even when it would like to dictate the pace. And reacting all the time consumes more than attacking with clear objectives. Another important point is that this finding shatters a fundamental psychological expectation, the idea that the enemy, under sufficient pressure, would eventually yield ground definitively. When this doesn't happen, war ceases to be a sequence of achieved goals and becomes a continuous management of risks. Each day becomes an exercise in containment, not resolution. And this affects not only decisions on the map, but also overall confidence in the planning. It is at this stage that the report begins to take on an almost symbolic weight. It transforms into an internal reference, a silent reminder that the adversary is not behaving as expected. This is not about overestimating the enemy, but about recognizing it as a constant factor, impossible to ignore. And when an army is forced to always plan taking this into account, something essential changes in the conduct of war. The most interesting thing is that this change doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in. An adjustment here, another there, a more cautious order, a reserve maintained as a precaution. Small decisions that, added together, alter the strategic course. And they all originate from that initial realization, seemingly simple but profoundly disturbing. Looking back, it becomes clear that this was a silent turning point, not marked by a major battle or a public announcement, but by a shift in mindset. The war against the British ceased to be seen as something that could be ended quickly and began to be viewed as a long-term problem. And this change in perspective set the stage for the impact that this report would have later when it came to light and was analyzed outside the heat of the conflict. In the 10th point, everything that previously existed only within closed rooms, confidential reports and conversations between officers takes on a new dimension. When the war ends and these documents begin to be studied outside the heat of the conflict, the impact is immediate. Not because they reveal a spectacular defeat, but because they expose something that rarely appears clearly in military records, the admission of a limitation. For historians and analysts, that report was not just a curious detail. It was a window into understanding how, at a certain point, the German war machine recognized that it was facing an adversary that did not fit its model of quick victory. The shock comes precisely from the sobriety. There is no dramatic language, no attempt to justify failures, no exaggeration. The text merely records a fact that, seen from the outside, confirms what many Britons already felt during the war, but could not always prove with enemy documents. The persistence of the troops of British Army, the ability to remain present, organized and operational even under extreme pressure, was being clearly and objectively recognized by the other side, and that carries enormous weight when it comes from those who were trying to defeat them. For post-war audiences, especially in the United Kingdom, this type of document helps to reconstruct the true scale of the effort made. It's not about exaggerated heroism or fabricated stories after the victory. It's about confirmation. Confirmation that the hardship endured, the sleepless nights, the slow and seemingly inconclusive advances had a profound cumulative effect. Even when there weren't big headlines, something was happening, something that gradually undermined the adversary's confidence in their own strategy. This report also changes how the conflict as a whole is understood. It shows that the war was not decided solely by great battles or spectacular moments, but by continuous resistance, organization, and the ability to not disappear. The famous phrase ceases to be merely a historical curiosity and comes to represent a broader truth. Winning is not just about advancing quickly, but about persevering when everything conspires to stop you. And persevering is costly, both physically and mentally. Over time, this interpretation spread. The document began to be cited, analyzed, and contextualized, and the more it was studied, the clearer it became that it doesn't just speak of a specific episode, but of a central characteristic of British action in the war: the refusal to succumb to expected collapse, the willingness to continue even when victory seemed distant and the effort seemed endless. This helps explain why that prolonged confrontation had such a profound impact on enemy planning. What's most interesting is that this shock doesn't stem from something grand, but from something almost banal: continuity. The fact that week after week, month after month, British troops remained there. Not always advancing, not always shining, but always present. When this is acknowledged in an enemy report, it gains a historical value that goes far beyond its size or language. And perhaps that's precisely why this phrase has stood the test of time, because it summarizes, in a raw and direct way, a reality that couldn't fit into official speeches or war slogans. It reveals that at a certain point, someone on the other side had to stop and admit that the conflict wouldn't be resolved in the way that had been imagined. And understanding that moment completely changes how we see everything that came before and everything that was necessary to reach the end. What did you think of this story? Did it change the way you see those weeks of war and the British resistance, which often goes unnoticed in books? If something it made sense to you, leave a comment, because it's what keeps this kind of content alive and shows that it's worthwhile to continue bringing real stories without exaggeration or fantasy. Leave a like now. It really helps the channel reach more people who like to understand history as it was. Subscribe and stay with us, because there are still many inspiring stories like this to tell, stories that don't shout but remain.